So the point of today's session is that within most economies in Europe, but particularly from a UK context, there's been a general move towards introducing competition into a whole range of markets. So we've seen the deregulation of all kinds of things like telecoms, energy, mobile phones, all that sort of stuff. And there's loads and loads of benefits of competition. So in terms of increased choice, reduced prices. So generally, competition has real potential to deliver a whole load of benefits. But there have been a number of markets which are of particular interest to both regulators, but also, you know, as a good formal civil servant, to ministers and the government more generally. And these are markets which often have quite a lot of tricky consumer issues, which, in my mind, tend to be around markets that are quite complicated, but also actually, in many cases, quite boring. So things like energy, banking, all this sort of stuff, that people, you know, they need these things as part of their lives, but it's not necessarily the most exciting or focal point of their life. So the point of today's session is to consider how behavioural insights, behavioural economics, psychology, whatever you want to call it, how that might influence how we regulate markets and how we think about some of the issues that have come up in those markets. So the traditional kind of demand and supply, how you get that to work, and are there any questions about how we approach regulation? So is it true that in all cases competition will deliver the best outcome? It's quite a timely question in light of the CMA's current investigations into energy and banking. But we're going to be talking very much from a kind of general level. So we've got four really great speakers. We've got Paul Heidheus, who is the Lufthansa Chair in Competition and Regulation at the European School of Management and Technology. So Paul writes on a number of topics in industrial organisation. Just kicked my glass of water. And a lot of his work recently has focused on the functioning of markets where consumers are partly driven by psychological factors such as things like social preferences, loss aversion, time inconsistency, all the things that you will be very familiar with from the behavioural literature. We also have Amelia Fletcher, who is now the Professor of Competition Policy at the Centre for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia. She's also a non-executive director of the Financial Conduct Authority and a member of the Enforcement Decision Panel at Ofgem. And Amelia was chief economist at the Office of Fair Trading between 2001 and 2013. So she has a whole wealth of experience in terms of actually thinking about some of this stuff. We also have Stefan Hunt, who works at the Financial Conduct Authority. So Stefan is the head of behavioural economics and data science. The team supports the policy, competition and supervisory work of the FCA, and they've done a load of really, really interesting work around all kinds of issues. For example, price regulation around payday loans, and I know they recently released a whole load of econometric work they've done looking at things like reminders about overdrafts. And then last but definitely not least, we have Daniel Gordon, who is Senior Director of Markets at the Competition and Markets Authority. So we've got a very heavy regulatory contingent here. He was previously Chief Economist at the Competition Commission and has over 20 years' experience in competition policy, working at Ofcom, the Office of Fair Trading, and then started off his career at Treasury. So the format of today's session is each of the speakers will come up and talk, and then at the end we will have a general discussion. I should say that each of these people has kindly agreed to be here in a kind of personal capacity, so all of their views are their own rather than necessarily of the body which they currently work for. But yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the session.
You're rightly worried about the water. Okay, so I'm going to talk about competitive markets, mistakes, and the potential for regulation. And sort of my starting point is, at least up to 2000, if you talk to any kind of competition regulator or something, they would have told you with absolute certainty the best form of consumer protection is competition. And so where does sort of this idea come from? There's some idea that even if consumers don't get it all right, there's enormous safety in markets. And so the basic idea I'll try to do with a thought example. So suppose consumer has a value of $70 for, let's say, a bank account, some basic service. And there's many competitive firms, so you take competition seriously, who can provide the service at a cost of $50. Okay? But this consumer makes mistakes. Once this consumer sort of signed the contract, he's going to incur all kinds of costs that he doesn't anticipate, overdraft charges, something. And in my example, let's say, totally to his surprise, he's going to end up paying $100. Okay? Completely surprised in additional fees that he doesn't even contemplate, so he really makes mistakes. Well, then, if you think about it, when he comes through the door, what's the net value of this consumer to a firm? Well, it costs $50 to serve him. I know I'm going to take $100 out of unexpected fees from him, so I make a net of $50. So what am I going to do? I'm going to be willing to pay up to $50 to get this customer. And if I'm in strong competition, I have to pay this $50, otherwise someone will outcompete me. So although the consumer gets it completely wrong, he's safe. All you need is competition. And I think this was a prevalent thinking. And what I'm going to, so despite considerable consumer misunderstanding of contract terms, there's safety. But I think the last 10 years of the literature on especially exploitative contracting shows that this reasoning is very particular to this example and basically wrong in general. And so competition will not, perhaps unsurprisingly, solve this. And so in the UK banking case, sort of one of the things people looked at, and sort of this is a nice paper by Armstrong and Vickers, is there are some people who incur overdraft charges. They often incur them a lot, and this can be the poor part of the population. And so some lawyer nicely framed this as a reverse Robin Hood exercise. I take from the poor to subsidize the basic banking charge. So I take from the poor to give to the rich, right? So your free credit card insurance, your credit card miles, those are paid by people who make mistakes, and they're the poor. Okay, so there might be a redistributive concern. I'm going to ignore this from now on. In a recent paper with Bouton-Kosigi, I looked at this, and you know, if people underestimate the price, okay, then this is almost like giving them a subsidy. If they base their decision on a wrong idea of the price, it's like subsidizing consumers. If consumers in the US credit card industry think they're getting a credit card for free, even ignoring, you know, all the perks you get with a credit card, but the average household ends up paying $900 in fees and interest, then they make fundamentally bad decisions in acquiring the credit card. There might be lots of people who would be much better off with a debit card. And so in what we think is a provocative piece, we kind of estimate, and there's all kinds of crazy assumptions in it, but back of the envelope, that there could be a welfare loss of up to $370 per household. That's for the same year the Office of Fair Trading said its impact of all its activities are about the same. So there is a potential huge amount of welfare loss because people think products are cheap that are not, and some people take these products that shouldn't. Okay, so this is one of the welfare losses. And so yes, there is huge potential for regulation. This is just that people underestimate the price if they get things wrong, but there can be many other mistakes. And when people make mistakes, you know, why do we like markets normally? Well, because people have all kinds of different wants, and the markets find out your want and produce the product that you like. You know, but it's equally great to find out the mistakes you make. And, you know, mistakes mean you think you're paying less than you're actually paying. And if I can find out what mistakes you make, and competitive markets are good at finding out things, then we're going to find out the mistakes you make and make profits from it. Competitive markets profit, so they are good also at finding consumer mistakes. And so we looked at this in the case of overborrowing. So the idea is naive, time inconsistent consumers think they're going to repay their debt reasonably quickly. We think we're going to behave better tomorrow than we actually do. Firms are aware of that. If you have debt, they can collect some unanticipated interest. If they want to collect a lot of unanticipated interest in this type of models, they have to shove a lot of borrowing on the consumer. So why do the consumers take on this borrowing? Well, they think they're going to repay early, so they think actually borrowing isn't that expensive. But if you take the true fees that you actually pay into account, it is expensive. So contracts will in this case, distort how much consumers borrow. There's lots of literature in general, if consumers make mistakes, I'm going to adjust my pricing to these mistakes, and that's going to lead to welfare distortions. Actually, there are some markets out there that are a real puzzle, like managed mutual funds. By and large, the literature tells us that most managed mutual funds managers do not beat the market, but they take high fee for basically providing no reasonable service. So how does this come about? Sort of one story, so this is work by Rani Spiegler, that sort of points out Well, you know, if I've beaten the market 10 times, most consumers attribute to me, he just does the theory, but let me apply it to this market. If I beat the market a bunch of times, consumers attribute to me that I can beat the market, that I have talent, rather than realizing that there's 1,000 people out there who try it, and I might just be one of the lucky people. Plus, by the way, the mutual funds that don't do so well, you just pull. So you try 20 funds, the one that beat the market, you keep going. So we might have services, competitive markets provide services that have no value whatsoever, okay? And you know, I'm not saying that managed mutual funds have no value whatsoever. If there wasn't one, you should invent one. The question is whether it's a good deal for the consumer. In this toy example I had at the beginning, the firm made $100 off you. You cost $50. It has to give you a present of $50 to sign up with them. Well, sort of, you know, if banks give you a present of $50 to sign up, you might be signing up with many, many banks. Effectively, it can be hard to give presents to consumers. I can't give all of the money I collect from mistakes up front in all situations. Why? Because some rational consumers or other people come in and just take the money. Right? So if I give presents, people will have not one but 20 bank accounts and take the present. If that's the case, we have kind of a price floor. You can't make the sign-up price too low. In that case, there is no presumption that people hand back the profits. They might stay with firms. And this will have all kinds of welfare distortions. Too many firms enter the market. We have supernormal profits, something we would be very worried about. In something like the managed mutual fund industry, there's sort of sophisticated consumers. If they sign up this fund, you understand the contract. Now, there's something particular here is, even if you understand the contract, you have to pay the managed mutual fund fee. If you're naive, you don't understand it. What happens in this type of markets? The sophisticated consumers get a different product than the naive consumers. But then competition, sort of, you cannot get any benefit from people around you understanding the product, something that economists often argue. But we just nicely separate the markets in those people who get it wrong and those people who get it right. And indeed, we've argued in some work that because these better products are around, you can't even compete on the fee as a managed mutual fund. To compete on the fee, I have to explain to consumers that the fee is important. Once consumers get that the fee is important, they might as well just go to the index fund. So the incentives to educate consumers can be really low. Now, why don't the index funds educate? Well, they do a little bit. But you know, this is a homogeneous product. Competition is fierce. Profit margin is low. I'm not going to spend much money on advertising campaigns. I just don't have the money to do so in a very competitive industry. And so these markets will not clear themselves up. And when you have this, we also looked a little bit on what incentives firms have to innovate, right? So people always say, don't regulate the financial industry. There's not going to be innovation. And so we looked at what kind of innovations could firms do. Well, they can make their product better. And typically, this is in contract terms, so everyone could just copy that. Or they can find a better way to trick the consumer. And we argue that the incentives to make your product better are not very big, because everyone can copy. The incentives to make it better, to trick the consumer better, well, everyone copies this. But if there's a price floor, that doesn't matter. Then we all, as an industry, make higher profits. So often, actually, the incentives to innovate are exactly wrong. And so what I was trying to give you is a teaser that do not believe that competition is just per se going to solve it. It's just not sort of a view. I'm going to ignore another important set of issues, and that is when consumers make mistakes. Maybe competition cannot even be that fierce. And all of what I've talked so far, I've just taken as given that there's fierce competition. If consumers are confused, I can sell, you know, red cars and green cars, even if they're all colorblind. Some people might buy green and some red because they don't manage to compare the price. So that means competition isn't even that intense. That's a, you know, true set of interests, and it's one that's really troublesome for economists because from how consumers behave, we deduce that they have preferences for variety. Maybe that's just mistakes. And that's something that's really something to... Now, if you go around and people say, okay, maybe the market doesn't work, but it's going to clean itself up. Just think about it. If you have a better product, just tell the consumer you have a better product than your competitors, and you have every incentive to do so because then you can sell it at a higher price and you're going to cash in. This is a very dominant argument or has been in the economics literature. Now, there's an implicit assumption in this argument, and this assumption is if I tell you that my product is better, A, you could believe me, but suppose I can actually explain it. The second assumption is you still want to buy the product. And there might be many reasons why you don't want to buy the product. If I tell you that in my hotel, the water costs only $19 and not 20 as by the competitor, you're going to go, oh no, I'm just going to bring a bottle of water. So often firms have a curse of debiasing. If I explain to the consumer how the product truly works, they're not going to be as valuable a customer. In the managed mutual fund industry, if I explain to the customers that, you just can't beat the market, they're just going to go to index funds and away they go. So the incentives of markets to clean themselves up are much lower, I think, than has been argued. Most consumers are fairly rational. Let me skip this in this crowd. Economics crowds, I always spend a lot of time on that. But let me emphasize that, you can be pretty rational and just have one mistake. The market has an incentive to find that mistake and cash in on it. And we should really think about markets as endogenously creating the context that you're bad at managing. We don't think of the naive consumer as always a bad term in this literature because people think of these idiots out there. No, think of smart people out there, but the market finds the one thing you can't do. I'm a little overstating. Consumers must learn mistakes. This is a difficult issue, but let me just argue empirically it doesn't look like they do. And I have some ideas of why they might not learn, not only in situations where feedback is rare, but also in situations where it's more common. But consumers don't understand the market. They'll just go to an expert. I think this is sort of one argument I've heard a lot, and something I'd like to sort of make you at least skeptical about. So suppose I go to an expert, some intermediary, right? So the common argument is this expert intermediary can help naive or otherwise biased consumers make better decisions. But what's the incentive to do so? Well, there are two steps sort of in choosing a product, right? So think of a life insurance or something like that. The first step is an intermediary could help the investor to work out what its needs are, what kind of insurance product you need. There's no strong reason to think that I have an incentive to help naive consumers, but at least I don't have sort of strong conflict of either, right? If you don't know exactly what insurance, maybe I'll tell you some insurance that you need. And maybe I'll spend even some effort, although it's not clear why I should spend effort and not just tell everyone the exact same advice. And then you choose a product to match your investors' needs and preferences. Now, higher commissions per se imply that the product is worse. Okay? So there's a direct conflict of interest between the intermediary and the customer. The intermediary wants to sell you something for which he gets a high commission. And so you start worrying. Furthermore, why can firms pay high commissions? Well, maybe they have a better product. Maybe they have lower costs, so they can make more profit, so customers to them are more valuable. Or they're just better at cheating the customer. They're better at deception. And so we should think in the financial industry, maybe those firms who deceive best are the ones who can pay the most commissions, like the managed mutual fund, going back to my favorite example. So can consumer protection policies help? And with this, I should finish. So often it's argued that consumer protection policies are ineffective because the price adjusts. And so here's a quote by, well, let me just skip. So there's this, so in this basic safety and markets argument, right, if the price that I take out of the consumer goes down, I'll give it lower present upfront. So in this type of environment, there is no hope for consumer protection policies. But basically, this is only true in the stylized example I gave you at the beginning. And I try to argue that in many markets, much more complex things go on, and there is a huge potential for consumer protection. So what kind of regulation should we look for? I'm gladly out of time. So I have a bunch of ideas, but the following speaker will tell you what to do. And here I stole ideas from all this list of papers.
Okay, well, I'm afraid I've been misbuilt up there because I'm not going to tell you what to do. And I've got a couple of slides at the start that slightly replicate what Paul has said, but I'll rush over them very fast. My main aim is to talk about some of the key implications of behavioural economics for industrial organisation theory, so how economics works, how markets work, and that's what Paul has kind of talked about a variety of examples. I'll talk about some other examples, but then I want to draw across from that into some of the interventions that we've actually seen in markets, primarily, I have to admit, in the UK, because that's the market that I know the best. You may have your own examples if you're not from the UK. I'm going to slightly tweak the title as well, because I'm going to just touch on irrational suppliers, which Paul didn't mention. We talk about irrational consumers quite a lot. Actually, the supply side, we know there's quite a lot of evidence that suppliers or firms don't just always profit maximize. They do lots of other things. They're run by humans and they have human traits. And therefore, that can have some implications as well. But I'm not going to focus on that. So I often find this a useful way of thinking about markets, which is competition as a virtuous circle. And you basically have your supply side with your suppliers all competing to win your customers, and you have your demand side with your supposedly active, informed customers choosing the products which offer them the best value for money. And it is really that process of suppliers trying to serve customers and customers going to suppliers that drives down prices, drives up quality, drives up productivity, innovation, market participation, all the really good things that we like competition and markets for. The trouble is that actually, as Paul has suggested, this can be quite a fragile circle, actually. If consumers actually don't search and switch, then competition between the supply side will be relatively weak because their customers aren't moving to the suppliers who offer them the best products. If consumers actually make mistakes and choose the wrong things, then actually, as Paul has emphasised, suppliers will compete to supply them the wrong things. That's how markets work. So competition will actively make things worse in that circumstance. And if firms can influence the decision-making of consumers, so can change the way in which consumers make their decisions to make that worse, then that will make things even worse. So you can end up in kind of what you might call bad equilibria, where this circle is not delivering the benefits that we would hope it to deliver in a kind of perfect world. And just looking at some of these blockages, on the supply side, the question is, are there enough suppliers who compete without barriers to maximise profits? And that is the sort of thing that in many countries competition policy is designed to look at. And there's been a very strong focus on that supply side for many years. There is this question about, do they actually maximise profits? But on the demand side, there's now an increased focus amongst regulators in a number of different countries on, are consumers really accessing the right information? Are they then assessing that information in a rational way? Are they then acting on that information and switching to the suppliers that really give them what they want? And you can immediately see that behavioural biases could affect all of those different steps of consumer decision-making. So I'm going to first just talk about some very general implications of some of the key findings of behavioural economics for markets. On the demand side, for a demand side that works effectively to deliver good consumer outcomes, a key point that's come out, and I think will come out in probably what Stefan says later as well, is that disclosure is not necessarily going to give you everything. There's been a very big focus, particularly in financial markets, on disclosure, giving information to the consumers. That deals with the asymmetric information problems that we've been aware of for a long time. It doesn't necessarily deal with behavioural biases if consumers can't digest that information properly, or if they have biases that are nothing to do with that information. We also can't rely so much on caveat emptor. So that's basically saying, look, if we've given you the information, we'll leave it up to you, consumer, to kind of make this market work effectively. We think increasingly we realise that caveat emptor, buyer beware, is not necessarily going to deliver us well-functioning markets that work well for consumers. As a result, I totally support the view that I think Paul was pushing towards, which is that consumer protection is a really important complement to competition policy if you're going to make markets work well. And I think also behavioural biases justify much more focus, not on information, but on choice architecture. What is how are the choices facing consumers framed? So as a regulator, thinking much more about those things and not just what information has been given to consumers. Another key point is that there's been a lot done in many markets to reduce search and switching costs, the real search and switching costs. That may not be enough, because actually what we find when we reduce those real search and switching costs to try and promote competition is that there are psychological barriers to search and switching. It may simply be, as Felicity said, that these markets are boring and no one can be bothered to search or switch. It may be other things, but basically if you don't think about what the psychological barriers might be, you will not get those markets to work effectively. And a core thing here, which is all remedies, that if you're going to try and intervene in markets, is really valuable, if you can, to test them. And I've given just 2 examples here where actually they were interventions to try and make markets work more effectively. They relied on consumers behaving in particular ways. Consumers did not behave in those ways, and the remedies were effectively, well, they were ineffective, and they were not tested in advance. So there's a bad lessons to be drawn from those 2 cases. I'll just cover supply side very quickly. I think one really interesting question for anyone that's involved in competition policy is how much weight should we be placing on the question of whether anti-competitive behaviour by firms is rational. In the US, a huge amount of focus is put on that in competition policy. This particular behaviour cannot be anti-competitive because it's irrational for the firms to do that. It's not profit maximising. Actually, I think when you start bringing behavioural biases into the thinking, that whole way of thinking about incentives for anti-competitive behaviour potentially has to be thrown up in the air. And I think that's quite controversial in the area of competition policy, but I think it's, I hope to see more discussion around it. I think there's much more scepticism that we might have around firms' overconfidence in markets and perhaps over-extrapolation, that the great performance of markets to date will continue into the future, over-extrapolating. We all know about the global financial crisis and that these biases were, at least arguably, quite important in that. I think that starts to explain things like the newly enhanced prudential regulation. And I think the final point just is that increasingly I think regulators are thinking about culture and governance within organisations rather than just assuming that firms kind of are a black box that just maximise profits. So incorporating behavioural biases then into the theory, actually quite a lot of people, when behavioural biases just became more popular or thought about, kind of said, oh, well, we just have to get rid of all that theory then, because obviously consumers aren't maximising utility and firms aren't maximising profits, so how could you possibly have a theory? How could you possibly have any models? Well, there is an extent to which that's true. It certainly makes these things more complicated, but because there are systematic biases, they actually can be incorporated into models and they can tell you very interesting things, and Paul does lots of that in his models. And Paul's already brought out a few findings, but a couple of the really key findings I wanted to bring out were, and Paul's really emphasised this, market problems are not necessarily solved by competition. And moreover, and Paul maybe didn't bring this out, market problems can actually be made worse with more competition. The reason is that if there's more competition, then firms want to do anything they can to restrict that competition again, because that's why they get more profits again. And so if they can do that via, for example, more obfuscation, more tricking of consumers, then they will have an incentive to do so. Neither of these suggest that kind of competition is in any way bad, but it does mean, it again emphasises that it's not simple to make competition work well for consumers, and you really do need to think in a holistic way about markets, thinking about the demand side and the supply side, and not just rely on competition policy to make competition work. Okay, so this is where I wanted to talk about some actual market interventions. And I've put these into some categories, but you could argue about the categories. The first is around behavioural biases that work to reduce search and switching. So, and these are all concerns that have basically been highlighted in the behavioural industrial organisation theory. So the first is that firms may engage in strategic overcomplexity or other forms of obfuscation to try and reduce search and switching. And I would argue that that sort of thinking led Ofcom, which is the UK telecoms regulator, to ban something called rollover contracts in telecoms, which were contracts where if you basically lasted a year, there was a penalty for terminating early, but then if you didn't terminate on basically the right day, a new yearly contract would start and you'd have another penalty. Surprise, surprise. Some people forgot to cancel on the right day. Ofcom has banned those. Ofgem, there were lots of issues around confusopoly in energy. There were so many variants of energy contracts. And partly as a result of that, Ofgem has now said, suppliers, you can only have 4 energy contracts effectively to try and reduce that confusopoly. Inertia. There's various different biases that could drive inertia, but default bias is the most obvious one. You go into a shop to buy something, and then they say, oh, well, would you like to buy this with that? So a secondary sale, it could be insurance or something like that. You have a very strong, as a supplier, point of sale advantage as a result of the inertia. You may also then have a very strong incentive to shroud the prices for those secondary products. So that consumers don't know how much they are. They don't even know they want them, but they certainly don't know how much they are till you're at the till buying. And the authorities, the OFT, has looked at this in extended warranties for domestic electrical goods. The FCA is currently looking at it in respect of general insurance add-ons. And I would argue that the big cases around Microsoft Internet Explorer and the ongoing case in relation to Google in Brussels kind of fall under this heading as well. And then firms may do anything they can not to sell through routes that make search and switching easier. Actually, Paul mentioned intermediaries as a possible factor, but price comparison websites, internet more generally, could be factors. And I think they could potentially explain why DG Competition in Brussels one of the reasons why they've taken such a strong stance in favour of the internet and against any sort of vertical restrictions that allow suppliers to restrict what distributors do in terms of selling on the internet. And I've given an OFT case there, which kind of falls under that heading. I'm running out of time, so I'll just rush through the next 2 slides. There's a whole bunch of things around price framing and anchoring and default bias. So one obvious thing, firms can frame their prices. They charge, $50, but they say it's $50 or £50 down from £70. That's the true price, even though we've never charged it. That kind of reference pricing is very clear in the literature, and OFT has taken action there in respect to furniture and carpet retailers. The entire market was doing this. Firms, another thing is engaging in drip pricing. So you give a price up front, and by the time you get to the end of the process, suddenly all these other charges have revealed themselves. But by that point, you've got endowment bias. You've kind of bought into this product, and you've also spent a lot of time, and you just don't start again. And you buy the product, and you don't go and search again. So the OFT has looked at this, has banned payment charges for airlines for debit cards, and the CMA has recently looked at this in respect of car rentals. And there's also issues, very similar issues around pre-ticked options. I'm sure you have thought about these before on the internet, where it's an option, but it is pre-ticked and it's not included in the initial price. That is now banned under the new consumer contracts regulations all across the EU, outside of financial services, and the FCA is introducing it for general insurance add-on products as well. And the final area is around consumer overconfidence and myopia. Again, Paul mentioned this. Yes, borrowers who are overconfident and or myopic may borrow more than they afford. So the Financial Conduct Authority requires firms to do affordability checks for mortgages and for consumer credit. So they actually require firms to do some of the work that the behaviourally biased consumers aren't doing. Firms may exploit consumers' overconfidence and myopia through extortionate contract terms. Against Paul, again, Paul mentioned this. So through high penalty charges or high default fees, the OFT has done work on brought a case against gym contracts for this, and actually it's the first UK case I'm aware of where behavioural economics evidence was referred to and used in the final judgment in that case. And the FCA likewise has a price cap for payday loans that includes across all of the aspects, including the default fees. And finally, in competition policy, there's been a kind of hands-off attitude to aftermarkets cases because people have thought, oh, consumers can sort themselves out in terms of aftermarkets. I think that may start to change now. So I'm going to leave that one and just say, to conclude, I think behavioural economics may justify the existing policy stance on a number of things, such as the important role of consumer policy in well-functioning markets. It may start to change our stance on some big picture issues. I think it's had a really big impact actually on how people are now thinking about disclosure and caveat emptor. Maybe in the future an impact on the importance of anti-competitive incentives in competition cases. And then when you go down into the detail, I think there's lots of implications for market intervention. Things like the pre-ticked boxes literature has already had a very big impact in terms of changing the regulations. I think others will take time to gain acceptance. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how psychology and economics can really help us protect financial consumers. I'm from the Financial Conduct Authority, and this is the one of the UK's financial regulators. We, amongst other things, focus on retail financial markets, so consumer credit, such as credit cards, mortgages, insurance products, investment products. So what I'm going to do in the talk is quickly cover the opportunity to apply behavioural insights. Luckily, I don't need to do too much on this because Paul and Amelia have already covered that ground largely. And I'm really going to try and focus on 3 examples. Only 2 of the 3 examples have been frontline already. And then I'm going to quickly touch on challenges as well. Okay, so behavioural economics can really help us understand what drives consumer decision making. This is really very important to understand why people are making the choices they are. Very importantly, it can also help us understand what consumers really want. For me, actually, the idea and the concept of true preferences is very helpful. It's very hard to get at welfare if we don't have some kind of concepts. But again, I'm going to skip over this for now. But then we really need to understand, well, how, given the shape of consumer demand, how is the supply side going to react? So Paul and Amelia cover this in a lot of detail, but there's a lot of things that can happen there. So there's a very rich literature, both on in the pure psychology literature right through to behavioural industrial organisation. It's really important to understand this stuff when we're thinking about markets. So what do we want to do as a regulator? Well, we want to look at the problems. We want to use the theory and the empirical evidence that I just was discussing. Then we also want to look at the institutional details, what's going on in a specific circumstance, because often there's lots we don't know about a specific situation. And we really need to be very empirically focused once we realise there's a very rich array of things that people could be doing. So I think you need to create original empirical evidence. We've heard a lot over sort of today and yesterday about field experiments, and I'm a massive believer in field experiments. I think especially as regulators, we need to think also on top of that of using, where possible, lab experiments. I've got some, I think there's a lot of caveats there, but very, very importantly, natural experiments as well. So 2 of the 3 examples I'm going to focus on are focused on natural experiments, and I'll explain a bit more what that means when we get there. But also you might just want to be using descriptive statistics, correlations, even sort of predictive analysis. I think once we get more into a world of data science, we're going to try and understand what predicts behaviour. We're going to learn a lot from that. And then we need to think about solutions. So we've heard a lot about nudges, of course, today and yesterday. But actually, as this has already been alluded to in this session, we might want to start thinking about some harder measures as well. You really want to try and think about what's going to be the best intervention to help improve welfare, whilst taking into consideration innovation. So the first example, so I'm going to focus on payday loans. So for those of you who are maybe not in Anglo-Saxon cultures, don't know about payday loans so much, these are high-cost, short-term loans. So in 2012, 2013, which is where this study has come from, the average loan size was £250. It was for 17 days. For each £100 that people would be borrowing, they'd have to pay back a little bit more than £120 on average over the market. So if you annualize those percentage rates, you get to over 5,000%. So obviously that got a few headlines. So you've got to think about, so we were tasked by Parliament in December 2013 to had the duty to impose a price cap on this market. But the structure, the level, all the details were down to us. So we had to think, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to think about that? So the first question we need to think about was what's going to happen to firms and firms' lending as a result of the cap. So we built a very complex supply model, which I'm not going to go into today, but it's pretty obvious from basic principles that if you impose a price cap, you're going to see a reduction in lending. Some people are not going to get loans. We should worry about that. We should care. We should think about what's going to happen to those people. So we need to think about what are the options for individuals who don't get loans. And very, very importantly, and this is where behavioural insights is really, really key, is are these people going to be better or worse off as a result of not having payday loans? So how are we going to answer that? Well, a natural experiment. So a natural experiment is when, for some reason, in the data, in the historical data, we can get some effectively true random variation that can work just like a field experiment. And this is what we had in this market. So it turns out when you go to a payday loan company, the vast majority of firms are going to credit score you. So credit score is the chance of you paying back, and that will vary between 0 and 1,000 for most firms. And what we see is an example here, if you look on this chart on the left. So we've got for a bunch of individuals here, we've got the credit score on the x-axis. If you look at the y-axis, you look at the probability of getting a loan. This is not the probability of only getting a loan with the firm that you've applied at. This is the probability of you getting a loan anywhere in the whole market. And what we see, we can see, and this is based on real data, what we see is a real jump in that probability of getting a loan, so quite a large jump. So okay, that turns out to be kind of useful. We've got a discontinuity. This technique is called regression discontinuity. And we can actually look at a whole bunch of different outcome variables and we say, are there any jumps when we look at the outcome variables? And if there are jumps, we can infer that those jumps were caused by the payday loans. There's a lot of technical stuff behind this, but just take that for read for now. So for example, this is the probability of missing non-payday payments. And we find actually there's a causal effect of payday loans on missing non-payday payments. So what we did was we went out to effectively all the firms, the top 37 firms in the industry, and we used our legal powers to get all of their data, all of the firms. We then matched that to the credit bureau files. Somewhat worryingly, we saw 4.6 million people, which is about 10% of the adult population in our data set. And we were able to look at a vast array of different outcome variables and try to ascertain what was the impact of payday loans. Now, we're only looking at the impact for people who've got relatively low credit scores around this 500 level. It varied for different firms. It wasn't 500 for all. And then we can look at the causal impact of payday loans. So I'm picking one outcome variable here, and what I'm measuring here is that jump, that difference. And you can see before people apply for the payday loan, there's no difference. That's what you want. You think of it as a treatment group versus a control group. They're balanced. But in the month that people take out the payday loan, they use overdrafts less. Well, you'd hope. But it's relatively small. It's about a 1 to 2% effect. And this is off a base of about 20%. But by 3 months afterwards, after taking out payday loans, they're 4% more likely each month to go into their overdraft. And that's persistent for a whole year thereafterwards. So we can think about behavioural models to try and interpret this kind of evidence. There's a vast array of other outcome variables we were able to look at as well. And broadly, the evidence suggests that payday loan use worsens financial outcomes. So this was very important and useful evidence trying to think about how far did we want the price cap to bite, how far should the price cap bite, and we were able to use the behavioural insights and the data and the empirical analysis to calibrate this price cap. Okay, second example. This is the personal current accounts in the UK. So the issue here is that people tend to use overdrafts quite a lot. Overdrafts are very expensive. Certainly true in the UK and also in the US. Also, switching rates are very low. Very famously in the UK, Dave Ramsden mentioned this earlier, but famously in the UK, you're more likely to get divorced than you are to switch your bank account. And so we wanted to look at, there's a bunch of innovations that had been some of them have been trying to solve some of the problems. In particular, there's annual summaries, which is a regulatory-driven innovation. So the idea is every year you get a piece of paper. It tells you the amount you spent on overdrafts, tells you the amount of interest you earned, tells you average balances, all these kind of very useful things. It's a natural stopping point where you would think about, do I want to stay with this firm or not? And at the same time, there's also some commercial initiatives. There was SMS alerts and mobile banking, though SMS alerts, there was at some point the regulation forced everyone to do those. And we want to say, what's the impact of these different initiatives? Do they seem to be solving the problems, or do they not seem to be solving the problems? And luckily, we persuaded a financial institution to give us very rich representative data on 500,000 people. This is representative of the UK population. And we can actually look, and we can use, again, a natural experiment. In this case, the annual summaries had a staggered rollout that's nice and exogenous, and we had to do some econometric stuff to control for selection for the other two. And we can look annual summaries, really precise zeros. This is overdrafts. This is the measure we're looking at. Really precise zeros. No effect of annual summaries on this particular measure. Same's true when you look at switching as well. But when you look at mobile banking and SMS alerts, you start to see some significant effects. So SMS alerts had caused a 5% reduction in overdraft use. Mobile banking, an 8% reduction. The two together, there's a complementary effect. It's not 13%, it was 24% reduction in overdraft use. So we're seeing some quite significant changes going on. So this, I think these findings were useful for the CMA, but Daniel can tell us whether that's true or not. And they've been citing this study a bunch recently, so I hope that's true. But it's also relevant for in Europe, where actually there's a payment accounts directives just come through. It's mandated annual summaries in 28 different countries. So we've got to think about, is that the right thing to be doing or not? And by the way, annual summaries, this isn't necessarily against annual summaries per se, it's against how they've been done in the past. So next we want to look at the savings market. The issue in the UK is that there may be bonus rates. You get a high rate at one point in time, but that rate drops down. You end up on a low rate, but many people may not switch away. Alternatively, you may end up just in a product where the price changes over time and you end up on a poor rate. Either way, you end up on very poor interest rates. And this was true well before interest rates were very, very close to zero anyway. So we want to try and say, there seems to be a problem of inertia here. What can we do to help solve that problem? So in this case, we actually did use a field experiment. We partnered with a regulated firm. And we looked at sort of disclosures we had given before or after the end of a bonus rate. And we want to see what impact that would have. In this case, we saw actually a substantial increase in the switching. So there's a number of details, number of nuance, but the main thing is actually the disclosure actually did seem to work here. And we think primarily it's just a reminder effect. So it's pretty simple, but people just need prompts. That's actually the role. So we're now using this, and we're actually working with 5 different firms. We've got randomized experiments going on right now in the field, and the results of those experiments are going to help us understand how should we form the rules so that we can actually have the disclosure working as best as possible to help people make effective choices. Okay, some challenges with integrating behavioural insights. So as a regulator, you don't have any consumers. They are the firm's consumers, and you're that one step beyond. And that's actually very important because we're getting much less information about consumer behaviour, consumer attitudes, or these kind of things. And that can be very tricky. If we want to do field experiments, I thought about this quite a lot, and we can't, I sort of wanted a power at some point to be able to, for firms could work with us when there was an important issue. If you think of that practically, I really think that's not going to work. So the firms have to agree to work with us. You end up in a negotiation about what are those treatments going to look like. And so you're constrained in terms of what you can do. Now, there's ways that you can make it more likely that firms will work with you. Firms' systems issues and logistical constraints are really considerable. And obviously, you don't always know the full truth about these matters but it's very clear from the specifics of the dealings that actually there's some massively important systems issues. They're just not collecting the right outcome variables at all, and it's going to cost them millions to change their systems to do that. Or their marketing schedule is done a year in advance, and you're trying to do things. So these are real things. Also, regulation involves very specific legal processes. There's a very detailed legal basis to what we do. That might involve, in the case of payday loans, very specific timelines. That can actually be pretty tricky to work with, especially if you're doing field experiments. So the CMA in particular has a lot of issues because it has very fixed schedules indeed, so it can be quite hard to do field experiments sometimes. With all of the above, especially these legal constraints, it can be quite tricky to partner with academics. Now, it's tricky at the best of times, but in this particular, it can be very hard for academics to get the goals that they need, which is typically publishable papers, plus meet all the other considerations at the same time. Okay, so to conclude, I genuinely believe, I think we've shown to at least some degree, that behavioural insights offer a real opportunity to make policy much more effective. First of all, it's just through really understanding the literature is, I think, is very, very important for just understanding what's going on with demand and what's going on with supply. But then also, it's the methodological toolkit, so collecting the right kind of data, thinking about whether you're getting data on different types of choices and different kind of frames from less experienced people, from more experienced people. Or, you're looking at beliefs, you're looking at regret, all these kind of things can really help you build up the right kind of picture. Then lastly, you need the full empirical toolkit. So it's not just field experiments, especially in regulation. You need to be thinking about natural experiments and lab experiments, and also other forms of information as well. And I guess my last point, and this chimes with what Amelia was saying as well, and it seems to be, and this is now conventional wisdom in most regulators, there's a failure of much mandated disclosure. I don't think that it doesn't necessarily means that we're going to stop doing disclosure, by no means at all. I mean, obviously it's important to inform people, but we just need to get much, much smarter about the precise nature of the content, the timing of it, and lots and lots of details. And luckily, as things are developing and we're getting far much more delivery of services digitally, there's far more choices and far more opportunity for actually giving information in the right time, in the right kind of format. So there's lots to be done.
Thank you very much. I must say it's a real pleasure to be a part of this exciting event. Thanks to the Behavioural Insight team and to Felicity in particular for inviting me, and also for the very useful input provided into our casework. I must emphasise the disclaimer up on the screen, particularly as Felicity mentioned in her introduction. We have some live cases in the sorts of areas we're touching on. The views I'm talking through here are personal views. They should not be interpreted as a position of independent groups in the CMA or of the CMA in particular. There may be some resemblance in areas. I'd have a big problem if there were, but I'm not going to tell you about those. Now, Felicity suggested that I discuss the role of behavioural economics and the challenges involved very much from the practitioner's point of view, and I've taken her word on that. And with that in mind, I was hoping to cover two areas. The first was to talk about the CMA's use of behavioural economics and how that's played in. And secondly, and for the main part, to talk through some of the challenges we face in designing remedies. And when that's necessary, when we've decided that's the right approach to take. Now, I don't promise to answer Paul's question. What I'll do is explain some of the challenges we face in that voyage. So, for those not familiar, the Competition and Markets Authority, who are we? Well, we formed last year out of a merger of organisations that might be a bit more familiar, the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. There's what we do, that sets out a very high level what we do. I don't propose to go through that in detail, just to mention two things. One is that we have not just competition-related powers, but powers in relation to consumer protection, and also powers in relation to holistic investigations and studies into markets. And with that sort of group of powers, we are in a very fortunate position that we can have some very, albeit lofty mission, but a very general mission to make markets work well. We don't have to sort of focus too much on the particular instruments, the particular legal tools in order to do that. And that is actually where behavioural economics we found absolutely indispensable, because if you were to understand how markets work and to form proper conclusions, you obviously need to know how consumers actually behave in them. And that is essential when we're looking at markets that are not necessarily problematic on the supply side. There might be many players. They might not be very concentrated. There are oligopolistic markets, but problems arise because of how consumers interact. And Paul and Amelia talked through some very clear examples of how that might arise. And it's also, so that's for the diagnosis of the problem. And what I will talk about in a bit is the assessment of the remedy. And that is a lot harder, I think, for us at the moment, because it involves looking forward and drawing drawing views from our current position of knowledge. So here's some examples of some cases. I think it's not, what I just wanted to illustrate, it's not hard to find examples of cases to illustrate where behavioural biases have been a very central feature of the conclusion of our diagnosis of the apparent problem in a market. I don't propose to go through those in detail. There'll be some friends to people in the audience, definitely those from the UK. But I would go beyond saying that we found behavioural economics useful. I think we find it absolutely indispensable to understanding the nature of the problem and what to do about it. And so we are, I think, on the diagnosis side, we've travelled a lot of territory. But I want to talk particularly about the remedy side, and perhaps to draw on a theme that I think Stefan was illustrating about how we're trying to learn what to do there and the sorts of factors we have to play into that assessment. So to frame that discussion, let me start with, albeit crude categorization, between two types of approaches you might take if you're thinking that intervening in a market might be the right thing to do. The first about market opening, the second behaviourally focused. Market opening measures are basically allowing more competitors in the market, or those competitors are there, allowing them greater freedoms to compete. Examples at the bottom there: deregulation, addressing barriers to entry so more can come in, and also in exceptional circumstances, such as British airports was one that the CC did in the past, is to break up, so there are more competitors in the market. The risks of that I don't need to labour to this audience, but they are about, well, those competitive markets to work need active consumers who are in a position to engage properly. So that's market opening measures. Now, turning to the second category, behaviourally focused measures. Now, these recognise that exact point, that for these markets to work well, you need active and engaged consumers. And if that might not be the problem, that might not be the case, that might be the source of the problem. And obviously under that label, there are a host of measures. I've just set out a few. Many more have been talked about. Amelia talked about many more. General ones about prescribing information provision, simplifying the nature of the product, so the choice isn't so difficult, and for high-risk cases, and payday loans is very much a case in point, as Stefan said, you might think of actually controlling the level of price. And the risks with those sorts of measures you need to bear in mind are actually the flip side of the benefits, many of the benefits that you might think about from market opening. If you're opening the market, you'll be looking at increased pressures on keeping prices, efficiency down, benefits of innovation. So if you're designing those, you need to be conscious of the implications they might have on that measure, on those sorts of mechanisms. So framing it like that, it's a crude categorization, but let me just illustrate with a couple of examples. First, electricity has been mentioned, is about limiting the number of electricity tariffs, by which I mean saying to each independent supplier, private supplier, that you can only offer a certain number, maximum, a certain number of tariffs in the market. Now, for the present purposes, that's, it could be one, you can only provide one tariff in the market, or it could be more. Ofgem, as Amelia has said, the UK's energy regulator currently has a 4-tariff rule, and the CMA issued a provisional view on that a few months ago. Again, I want to keep the discussion very much at a general level here. The main argument for that is, straightforward. The complexity leads consumers to be disengaged. Simplicity should lead to them becoming more engaged and making better choices and getting a better outcome as a result. And that's the main justification that's typically put. I think there are other arguments that come alongside that. One is that there's only limited room for product differentiation in energy. Electricity is electrons coming out of a wire, gas is gas. There's only so much you can really differentiate that. So you're not losing too much by keeping just one tariff. And the third one is worth mentioning, which is often put particularly on when it's just a small number of tariffs, 1 or 2 that's being proposed. And this is an argument that the active consumers, the inactive consumers will benefit from the view or from the position of the active consumers. So that everybody will be put on the most competitive tariff, which sounds quite attractive. Now, in assessing that, and those are actually pretty sensible reasons, I think, to start thinking about such an intervention. But you need to balance that against the risks. And first, energy is straightforward, but it still limits the room for differentiation. If there are high usage users, they might be cheaper to serve. They might want a better price. They might than low usage users. You'll be sacrificing those sorts of benefits, potential for cost-reflective pricing, and that will result in some sort of cross-subsidy. That cross-subsidy could go from the reverse Robin Hood, in the reverse Robin Hood direction itself. But also it can lead to those benefits that we associate with increased competition being compromised. So, for example, the role of intermediaries and the role of actually competitors in their ability to target customers and compete is limited because they have a much more blunt pricing instrument. And that could lead to higher prices in the longer term. Similarly, I mean, for the role of intermediaries, price comparison websites, brokers, those sorts of people, they are in a very different position in those markets. First, the business proposition isn't as straightforward. But secondly, the suppliers are limited. An energy supplier is limited in what it can give to a price comparison website because it can only charge a set number of tariffs itself. And that can be, I'll get onto price comparison websites and address a couple of Paul's points in a moment. But that can also lead to losing some of the benefits of price competition. And the last point is the flip side of the previous point about being put on the most competitive tariff. Well, we need to ask whether they'll be put on the least competitive tariff. Why will prices not go up as a result? Rather than they would go down? And that is clearly have very serious implications for products such as energy. So need to consider all the impacts is my message there, not just addressing the particular behavioural bias. So next example is price comparison websites. I think this is an important area for us to focus on, and regulators, competition authorities, policymakers, I think, are increasingly interested in these areas because of the very sorts of challenges we're talking through today. Price comparison websites are effectively a very effective way of doing what policymakers want consumers to do and helping them do it. If they work well, there's a business model there which should help consumers compare and make that easier, make it using available information. And moreover, and this is something that's often overlooked, something that policymakers and public authorities find a lot harder, they have a profit incentive to go and chase down inactive, disengaged consumers. So in these markets that might be flagged as not the most exciting to a day-to-day consumer and they really don't engage, here you are with meerkats and marketing campaigns to try and chase them down to get them to engage. And that should, in a competitive mechanism, lead to better outcomes for consumers. I flagged that point there as long as price comparison website competition is working effectively. I don't propose to dwell on that much aside from just on Paul's point. The question is, will they keep, Paul made a point about whether they would keep the commissions. Well, if there's competition between price comparison websites, just like between retailers, there should be competition for those commissions to be passed on to consumers in the form of beneficial prices. So that's the sort of benign model. But there are risks that we know about, risks in relation to particularly the trust that people have in using price comparison websites. And they relate, a lot of those relate to the impartiality of the advice that is received. And typically, 2 points are flagged in that area. The first is about undisclosed commission rates and whether that affects the positioning of products or the sorts of products that are listed. And the second is that they don't cover all suppliers, and it's not the one-stop shop it purports to be. And that can lead to risk of disengagement and poor choices on the part of consumer and lose those benefits that we were after. So there's a range of policy options, clearly, that are available. Here they are on a spectrum from on the level of regulatory intervention. One is for the regulator to run the price comparison website itself. The benefit is that the regulator has complete control there, but you do lose that market incentive. And in the UK, that's not generally done. It's done, there are a couple of examples where the regulator is actually in a unique position to get that information, and the private sector can't really get that information. The other options in the middle there involve implying some sort of conditions on price comparison websites. The first is in order to trade at all, and this is following a CMA recommendation to the FCA being sued on payday lending, for example, that you have to meet certain conditions. And that's clearly going to be used where there are areas of particular consumer risk. And the second, that third one there, is about accreditation, which is a very powerful mechanism in principle, that in order to get a recognized code membership that you can advertise to your, so you can say you are Ofgem, FCA, or whatever approved, you have to conform with certain standards. It's not saying in order to act in the market you have to, but you can use that signal to consumers. And that potentially is a very powerful signaling device to consumers and allows and goes with the grain of the market to help them do it. And that is probably the most used approach in the UK in those areas. But even those conditions, and I won't talk about them in detail now given time, but the conditions that are applied there can sometimes cut across some of the benefits and need to be thought about quite carefully. And then, of course, there's the option of doing nothing, allow the market to try and sort itself out, and we can talk maybe in questions about that, because Paul touched on this issue as well. But that does obviously require active and engaged consumers. So just a few thoughts about implications. I guess my key message is that when we're thinking about market opening measures, obviously we need to think about the challenges to consumer engagement, and there's been a lot of work on that. When thinking about remedying behavioural biases as well, however, we also need to think about the impact those have on the other benefits that competition can bring. We must avoid thinking in boxes and think holistically about what is the best approach for overall consumer welfare, not just now and for the longer term. It's generally better to look for behavioural interventions that go with the grain of the market for that sort of reason. Voluntary codes I've mentioned, effective informational remedies, and it's also a very exciting area is about increased data availability to allow active marketing and active intermediary market. But those obviously are not always sufficient, and sometimes there's need for more interventionist measures to be taken to address the risks. I tried to set out some of the general things that we think about, but these can be quite complex, these considerations, and much more complex than appear often at first sight. They vary, those general principles will vary in their application from market to market, and also at different points in time. And you might want to think in the early stages, at certain stages of a market, about certain forms of intervention, but also think about how that would play out in the longer term so that healthy competitive dynamics can prosper. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Jason McNamara, I'm from Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia. Just an overall question for the panel, I suppose, is that what struck me about all your talks was that it seemed to be about how to regulate more. And in Australia, we use behavioural insights about how to regulate significantly less. And I just wonder if I'm misinterpreting how you're talking about problems. You seem to be saying there's more problems and therefore more regulation, or are you really doing it to decrease regulation?
Who wants to take that one? Okay.
I don't think it, sorry, I have the advantage of being able to speak. I don't think you could say it goes either way. I think the idea that you can avoid regulation, or you should only do libertarian paternalism, that's not even defined in markets, right? So the libertarian paternalism kind of means I keep your choice set the same, but I change the default option. In a market, if I change some consumers' behavior, the supply side will react. The offers to consumers will react. So, I mean, you have to do what we've seen people here doing. You have to think of, through what the market outcome will be. I don't think we can say, information regulation is not a big regulation. Regulation of contracts, like the price cap, that's per se bad. I think you have to look at the market. And I think there's no presumption that you need definitely more regulation, but there's also definitely no presumption that you need less. So I'm a little surprised at the Australian policy approach.
I was just going to add that I think it's neither more nor less, but differently. So a lot of the time, as we talked about about disclosure, there's been a lot of disclosure, like it turns out, annual summaries in banking that hasn't been very effective. And in fact, there's some very nice field studies and lab studies that show disclosure can even have negative implications, so that effectively it confuses consumers, so they make a worse choice than they did without the disclosure. So the question is not kind of remedy or not, disclose or not. It's if you're going to disclose, how do you best disclose to ensure that it actually facilitates consumer decision-making that's really going to make competition work well and drive good outcomes?
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but just it's worth saying that the markets we've been talking about here are particularly tricky issues. There are lots of markets that all these guys, don't even look at because they do work well. So there's no process of thinking about how to fix problems.
So I don't have too much more to add. Just on the annual summaries, let's say we can't do better than that and it's still not effective, then you don't do it. I mean, it's cost with no cost with. I mean, there may be some other benefits. We need some outcome variables. So I wouldn't agree with that premise.
Okay. Sorry. Can we just, in the interest of get a few questions? So there was a gentleman at the back in the white shirt who had his hand up, and then if we take this lady, so we'll have that question and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. My name is Andreas. I'm from Denmark. I'm doing a PhD on behavioural public policy and market regulation. Just for the panel in general, when you're doing policy development and implementation, you're sort of balancing between what we know is true from research and investigations and what people believe to be true, because there's the political aspect of developing a policy, and it needs to have to resonate with the public, at least to be accepted. So have you ever had any experience with how that could be problematic? If the public don't believe that they are hyperbolic discounters, then proposing a policy that kind of builds on that can be problematic, I guess, or difficult at least.
So Daniel, I cut you off, so I don't know if you want to answer that one.
I'll try that.
The easy one. Yeah. Do you want to come? Well, I think Liz is just coming up now. She's getting her workout before lunch.
I welcome you to my world with that sort of question. So, one point that sort of, sometimes those issues of trust, so take the one on price comparison websites and intermediaries, can be a matter of perception rather than actuality. And it is really important, I think, for policymakers to deal with those questions head on. So it might be that people are thinking that there's a trust issue in relation to that, but let's see whether behaviour actually reflects that. And I think you do find, and these get big heads of steam when politicians and the press get involved as well. I think from the competition policy perspective, from the policymaker's perspective, the best solution is to come back with clear evidence. So we have looked at that sort of concern, and this is what we found. It is true, it is not. So they need to be dealt with head on through the evidence. And if I may, just to respond to the earlier question, I really would hope that the implication that we are looking to intervene is really not the conclusion. I think the central point is let's not just think of there's a behavioural problem in the market, we must remedy it. Let's think about a way of improving the way the market works, recognising there could be behavioural problems and there could be competition problems as well. And the benefits might sort themselves out or might need a little bit of nudging in the right direction.
Okay. I just wanted to add on the question at the back. There's been two of the examples that have been mentioned had incredibly strong political dimensions. One was that Ofgem 4 tariff choice, where effectively, I think it was basically foisted on Ofgem by government, although Ofgem might argue about that. And the other was payday loans, which was foisted on the FCA by government. We were going to be looking at how to regulate payday loans more effectively, but we weren't going to necessarily be going to a price cap. We were going to look at all the options first of all. And I think that one of the things that politics can do is kind of force you too fast to reach for one answer without looking at all the evidence first. And actually, the more that we can all do to say, these things are really complicated, there's pros and cons of all of this, can we really get a firm evidence base before acting? And saying that back to the political classes would be very useful.
Lady.
Hannah Lewis from Behave London. In the UK, we've made financial advice more transparent, which resulted in people pulling out of the financial advice market, meaning there's actually less available on the high street. What advice would we give to European cousins who are going through the same bouts of regulation now? How would we do it differently, if at all?
I mean, one thing we might ask is it a bad thing? So how good was the financial advice that people did get? And you know, it's going to sound like I'm implicating it was bad. There are some reasons to think that it was bad in some dimension, maybe not in others. And so you cannot answer this without looking at the evidence. So, you know, any specific market, if you give us a question like this, you're not going to get a clean answer without people looking at the evidence. And I think that's sort of the theme of this conference. It's true for markets as well, with one important difference. You know, you can't just do random experiment on how consumers work, because if you then sort of build on the evidence that you learn from the consumers, the supply side will react. Markets are not passive. And so you will have to have some theory in the background of how supply will react whenever you try to fix something. And so your example is, okay, some advisors pull out. Now we have to ask, how bad is that? How much worse are consumers' decisions? Are they really worse?
Anybody else like to add anything?
I was just going to say that it's a really good question. And I mean, I think that those that are getting advice are now getting better advice, but you're right that there are people that are not now getting advice that may have valued the advice before. And actually there's a big review now going on, it's just starting in the UK, about how better to get that kind of all sorted out. So I think rather than jump to a conclusion, I will advertise the fact this review is going on, and hopefully we'll come to some good recommendations at the end.
Okay. Any more? So we've got a lady in the white shirt. We'll take these last three. So it's four. Just you're hiding behind there. Lady, and then there's two gentlemen, and then one over there as well.
Okay, thank you. My name is Annemieke Duinstra from the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets. In the spirit of evidence-based research, I would like to ask, how do you prove that revealed preferences are anything but that there are problematic biases at play? So in practice, how do we deal with, so we have all these theories about how they can influence consumer behavior and how we could tackle that with interventions, but how do we prove that that's what's going on? How do we prove that it's not a taste for variety, but actually a mistake? How do we know?
Oh, were we going to collect four?
No, but I'm only going to let one person answer each one, so we can get something to eat.
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, personally, I would just point you straight to the writings of David Laibson, Bridget Madrian and some co-authors, Kosegi and Rabin. There's also some other stuff. I mean, so if you read, for example, the Bashir et al. Paper, they go very, very carefully at how a preference is revealed, and the main point is you need models. You need models to explain the variety of different things. So I talked, for example, I mentioned right at the end, I pulled a slide that was earlier, was you want to think about choices of more experienced people, less experienced people, choices under different frames. You want to think about beliefs. You want to think about beliefs in the future, retrospective beliefs, all these kind of things. There's a lot of different stated preferences. There's a lot of different ways that we can get at what the people really want. And what you tend to find is that actually with specific models of the kind of mistakes that people might be making, then you actually get to really understand. And then behind that, there's this concept, and there's some debate about this in the academic literature, but of true preferences, and that's what allows you to think about welfare. And if you actually discard that completely, it becomes very hard to look at these issues.
Okay, so there was, yeah.
Hi, I've got a kind of badly formed question, but I'm hoping that someone can say something clever about it. And that's that how does it differ when the behaviour is kind of fundamentally irrational? Now I'm thinking about gambling, so how would you regulate the gambling industry where people are sort of indulging in their behavioural biases and where the regulation at the moment seems to be just give them information, and information clearly isn't going to help that much with some of these biases. So I just wondered what your thoughts might be on that.
I mean, I'd take that a little bit. Only one person, so someone else should do that.
Okay, so yep. So I think of it sort of, going back to revealed preferences, right? So the presumption of revealed preferences, people satisfy a bunch of axioms that they don't, but let's sort of ignore that for a moment. People choose something, and then policy is based on what people choose. So sort of our presumption is people choose what's in their own interest. And by and large, we'll feel comfortable with this. But let me be very clear, this is an untestable assumption. It's just an assumption. We don't test with choice data, which is what economists normally look at. So in the case of addiction, you'd have to get additional behavioral evidence. And so people have tried to get neuroevidence. And there are some people who say addiction is one of these examples where your brain predicts forecasts and rewards in the future that don't realize. And so we need non-choice data to make this assumption. But I mean, the assumption that I'm very comfortable with, but that in a normal market you act in your own interest, is nothing that the data tells us. That's what maybe introspection tells us or something like that. And so what you're coming up with was examples where that is a problematic assumption. And I think addiction is. And the idea that, when I'm completely drunk at the bar, people like to do this experiment here, I really know that this next beer is still in my best interest. You can take this. This might be an assumption you feel comfortable with, or one you can question. It's the fact that I buy the beer is not going to answer it. You'll have to look at evidence from other areas. There's some work doing this.
Just to add to that, there's a paper that I was reading recently by Cass Sunstein about what he terms internalities. So it's kind of the opposite sort of what in the traditional economic literature is externalities. So about the kind of the stuff that happens inside you, but is a result of some of these biases, and how there might be the sort of the assumption that you operate in your best interest is always holds. So it'd be worth you having a look. I think there was another question, yeah.
Hi, if I mention one paper, a paper from 2002 by Gruber and Kozegi does this internality exercise in the term of taxation. And they argue that cigarette taxation, you cannot, based on externalities, we should probably subsidize cigarette smoking because people die at the right moment and don't collect social security. This is a crazy way of doing public policy. If you take the internalities seriously, and this paper discusses how, you get to completely different answers.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I work at Monitor in the regulation of NHS hospitals. You've talked about some very knotty markets with really complex issues here, and the regulations that you continually have to come up with to address these problems. Is there a stage at which people become so irrational and behave in ways that completely don't make sense, that coming up with more regulations doesn't make sense, and we actually need to think about, is competition the right answer? Is choice for consumers the right answer?
Who wants to go for that one?
I mean, in principle, there could be. I don't want to sort of start talking about the health service when you will know a lot more about that than I do, but in principle, there could be. I mean, the basis of the market economy is people are in a position to choose and make some form of rational decisions. If that is totally taken away, then clearly that presumption is seriously challenged and other models will be wanted to explore. I mean, there might be other competition models that can be pursued within that. That's not to say they're not, but that would be challenged. I mean, just while I've got the mic, a couple of the previous questions on the revealed and actual point. I mean, one of the things I know Stefan's done, and we are also doing in various cases, is comparing survey responses directly with actual responses from the supply side, and that's a very tangible way of sort of seeing how what people, well, to the extent of what people say they do, tallies with what they actually do. And on the point, that actually very almost profound question about, you know, where does it all stop if we're getting into sort of second guessing what people should be doing, what is their rational choice. Here we can, I think, be a bit humble and say, look, we are here to get these particular markets working in the best way for consumers, and that is within our remit. If it's getting into the very existence of those sorts of markets, that is going straight into central government elected people sort of views, and that is for, and we might be in a position to take those objectives and run with them, but they're not for us to determine, I think. But we need to be clear on what those lines are, and one of the risks of behavioural interventions is too much second guessing about that. What the Greeks actually, the ancient Greeks, I think, called weakness of the will, a kratio, this sort of people might not do what is best for them.
Okay, and then gentleman in the back corner, that's the last question.
Thank you. My name is Tim Chadbourne. I work at Public Health England. So my question is about consumer protection as it's been sort of discussed, consumer welfare seems to focus on financial outcomes primarily. And I'm just wondering if there's substantial considerations of consumers' well-being or health as outcomes. Hope that makes sense.
I mean, a cheap answer is that something, oh, you want to answer? No, you go.
You go.
Something like the cigarette taxation or so on is just not the role of a consumer protection agency. So you know, governments work by certain agencies doing certain things. What you're suggesting often would not be in the realm of competition or straightforward consumer protection policies, but it's by no means only financial, right? So some of the things you might think about, and you know, good or bad, is information, is how you provide information. So this is the pictures on, I guess, Australia on the cigarette packages. You know, you can think of that as a consumer protection measure. You can think of it as information. You can think of it as nudging. You can think of it as shocking. You can think of it as good or bad. It's something to you know, you can think about and analyze. And in general,
I'll just come back. I guess I was trying to refer to we've known very much about the wider social determinants of health.
Yeah.
So the financial aspects. So more the health and well-being outcomes related to
you mean?
transactions of people's financial state.
So do you mean things like, so I don't know, payday loans, if then somehow people have stress and anxiety and those... Okay.
So one thing I admitted when I talked about the payday loans, we also did, so we recognise very much credit bureau data only gives us a bunch of things, obviously financial outcomes. So we actually did a consumer survey of 2,000 people as well, where we mimic that same discontinuity design as well, so you're able to compare. We included subjective well-being, financial distress, health-based measures, lots of other things as well. So absolutely you need to take into account the full sort of like wide variety of things that could be accounted for people. Now, then it becomes tricky to trade off these things, but sure, we just need to face that and deal with it.
Okay. So that's it. Thank you very much. I also think, on a personal note, it's kind of exciting. So I've been in the Behavioural Insights team for about 4 years. When we started, we were very much a deregulatory force. So it was all about reducing regulation. And actually, I think, along with this conference, it's been a really nice transition into a much more sophisticated discussion of, it's not just about nudging. It's, as Amelia said, it's thinking about how regulation works. Are there more realistic models for kind of regulating, intervention, all that sort of stuff. So it's been really brilliant to see that you guys are also thinking about some of those issues. So thank you very much. I did have a list of stuff to tell you, but I think it's basically that lunch is downstairs. So go and help yourself. Thank you.